Hey there everybody, Eric from Outer Limitless Blades here to talk to you today about why I believe Work Tuff gear has attention to detail above and beyond all others. Now, to start this entire video, I know there are incredible custom makers out there that have extreme detail. A lot of the folding knife community, extreme detail, very detailed Damascus steel, all the little intricate details that you could build into a knife. But that's not exactly what I'm talking about here today. The attention to detail that I'm talking about is a little bit different. And so for this discussion and to illustrate my point, I thought the best way to discuss this would be through a demonstration of the Lanzetta. So again, Work Tuff gear, in my opinion, with attention to detail, different than everybody else, above and beyond everybody else. And most specifically, I am going to say, first off, of course, with fixed blade knives. But second of all, I'm going to say more specifically with users. And so this Lanzetta here, well, this is a Gen 1 design. This is a Vic Lin design and one of their early Work Tuff gear designs. And at this point, here we have the Lanzetta. Very similar, and in fact, if you were to take these knives and put them side by side and take a quick look, you'd go, yeah, of course, that's a Lanzetta. But in very many ways, these are very different knives, and it's that Work Tuff gear attention to detail that I'm talking about that differentiates these two knives and fairly substantially differentiates these two knives. So the only way I can truly show you this is through all of the little details, that attention to detail, the things that really have taken the Gen 1 Lanzetta and made it a Gen 2 Lanzetta. Now, to really discuss this in detail, I think you have to consider the fact that, first off, think about what goes into manufacturing a knife like this. There are a lot of hand finishes, but there are also a lot of machine techniques that go into this. All of the design work, all of the programming and all of the fixtures and all of the little things that Work Tuff gear needed to do to get this Lanzetta to come out the way it did, and for the way that it came out to come out the way it did time and time and time again, from copy to copy to copy. Now, not only within a single batch, but from batch to batch. And as they go through the course of time, Work Tuff gear often makes changes to their blades. So it would be very easy for them to stay with a Gen 1 where they have everything ready to go, the process dialed in, ready to make their next batch of Lanzettas. But instead, no. What does Work Tuff gear? They look at a great design and they can say, even though it's a great design, we can make it even better. They've learned a lot of lessons. They've worked with a lot of other designers. They've worked with other people in the industry. They've found new materials. They've experimented with new steels. And now they're going to incorporate all of those lessons into a Gen 2. So hence the Gen 2 Lanzetta. And again, at a glimpse, you'd think these are very the same, but they're very much not. And as we go through all the fine little details, you'll really start to see where these two knives truly do differentiate themselves to the point where they're almost different knives. Even though they're both Lanzettas, they're almost different knives. Now, before we get too far, I would like to say thank you very much to the people at Work Tuff gear who did provide this for this video. And if you like this video, this is my Outer Limitless Blades channel. I have taken all of my knife content and moved it from my primary Outer Limitless channel to here on Outer Limitless Blades. So if you're a fan of Outer Limitless, please like, share, subscribe, help support the channel, and get all of the relevant content you want to see about blades. So if you like Outer Limitless, thank you for checking me out and subscribe to Outer Limitless Blades. And so when we look at the details in the blade, even though this one's a little bit beat up, it actually makes it easier to see some of the lines. Like, for example, let's just say this is a 3/16 inch thick SK85. All right, so this is pretty much what you're going to consider to be a standard field knife thickness, really a light and nimble knife. it has an unsharpened swedge over the top, goes into that grind, which, obviously has a secondary bevel, grind angle, sweeping over into a choil. And if we look at the exact same details side by side with the Gen 2, you'll see that these actually greatly differentiate the way that they were made and generally the way they were approached. Now, just to say that one of the things that oftentimes is a component of a Gen 2 build is changing the steel. In the case of the Lanzetta, both of these happen to be SK85. However, as you take a look at the thickness right away, and unfortunately my calipers ran out of batteries, but take my word for it, this ringing in here right around 4.5 millimeters in terms of the overall stock thickness. Whereas the Gen 2, more like 5.5 millimeters in terms of the stock thickness. And I can tell you that that is probably not a mistake. If you know anything about Work Tuff gear, they're always trying to find a way to fine-tune their design, and that includes even getting the thickness, the perfect thickness, so that by the end of the build, you have the perfect geometry down on your cutting edge. So to strike the balance between chopping and, limbing capabilities here, but also the sliceability. Now next, as we take a look, the unsharpened swedge also changing shape by a little bit, but also changing thickness. As you take a look at the unsharpened swedge here, you can see it is quite thin by the time you get to the top of the unsharpened grind. So you can see at this point, really thin. Now, not really to say you could sharpen that into a sharpened swedge, but definitely thin, all things considered. Whereas now, on the Gen 2, you can see very thick. And not only is it thick, robust, stout. The ability to now baton without completely beating up your baton, but that is really square. So you could do some fantastic scraping with that edge, 90-degree spine, and the ability to really scrape some bark, rip on a ferro rod, anything you need to do. And that's, I would say, likely a combination of customer feedback and how they use their knives, but also, Vic and his expertise and experience with what people and other designers have wanted in their designs. And so custom tailoring the Lanzetta now to be a cross-pollination of what Vic had early designed in the Work Tuff days of, the very beginning and stages of Work Tuff development, to now a mature and refined and more customer-driven design that strikes the balance between all the different needs. And that's what I'm saying about paying attention to those details. Now, as you take a look at the transition between the unsharpened swedge and your primary bevel, you can see that the full stock thickness and the flat part of that stock coming across and hitting a point right about there, which is about 5 inches from the handle to that point. Whereas here on the Gen 2, from the handle to that point, well, it's way out here. That's about 6 inches from the handle to that point. And again, even though you'll look at the Gen 2 and the Gen 1, and you think right away that they basically look exactly the same, which again, they're very close, the difference in that point is considerable, and it changes the geometry of the blade shape, it changes the geometry of the grind, it changes the overall performance, and that's a subtle detail, but that's the attention to detail that you need to be able to make improvements from the cutting performance of the Gen 1 to what we should see in the cutting performance of the Gen 2. Now, for my next point, it's really difficult for me to illustrate. I tried to get an angle measurement here, and it's really hard on my particular laser scale. I'm going to say this edge on the Gen 1 is roughly about 18 degrees per side. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but that's what it's measuring, and let's just say, for the sake of the argument, that's what it is. Now, if you look at the size of that secondary bevel, nice and shiny there, catching the light, you can see it's probably, somewhere about 1/8 of an inch in terms of the overall grind. But here on the Gen 2, I don't know what the degree is, but I can tell you that this is super shiny, very refined, very sharp, and probably more like 1/4 inch in terms of the overall grind. So what that means is ultimately we are definitely changing the height of the grind and therefore the thickness behind the grind, the overall grind angle and grind geometry, and that will impact performance in cutting tasks, limbing tasks, and generally speaking, this is a nice size, wide grind, which should be really stout, yet at the same time, it is tall enough that we should have some excellent sliceability. It's really going to be a better slicer, should be a better slicer overall than the Gen 1. This is going to be a little more broad because it is a shorter grind, so it doesn't taper down quite as much. So a little bit more broad. Now, this was already a fantastic performer, and it does feel like it's going to be a little bit thinner behind the edge versus on the Gen 2, a little bit thicker there. Now, I was able to get my calipers up and running, and you can see, if I'm trying to be fairly careful, behind the edge here, I'm going to call it 0.05. So that was the Gen 1. And on the Gen 2, again, measuring in the same spot, I'm going to call it 0.068, closer to 0.07. So again, although it is going to be thicker behind the edge, it has a much taller grind, and I think this is really going to strike a better balance between overall sliceability, yet the ability to wedge through wood for batoning, splitting tasks, things that need just a little more heft. This should be a little bit heavier. Let's check in terms of the weight, which the Gen 1, 14.9 ounces, and the Gen 2, 17.9 ounces, which I'm not going to say is a crazy difference. However, that just goes to show that there is more blade mass for the most part, and I guess potentially some handle mass, but I would say more blade mass in the Gen 2 than on the Gen 1. Which makes sense if you take a look at the overall thickness, which makes sense if you look at the thickness behind the edge and the fact that this is going to be thicker by the time it tapers down along that flat grind to the secondary bevel on the Gen 2 versus the Gen 1. Now, more attention to detail. Take a look at the Ricasso and the finger choil area. You'll notice that the Ricasso and that plunge grind, that ends up about 50% into the diameter of that finger choil. So in other words, you'll notice as you grip this, almost your entire grip there is going to grip right into that nice thick area, almost a full thickness of the steel right there. Now the Gen 2, for me personally, I don't like this grind quite as much. I know from a blade performance perspective, this is probably better, but you'll notice that much less in the way of a Ricasso here. So you can see that plunge grind is way back by the end of the handle scale and underneath that scallop, which means that the vast majority of your finger choil is on thinner steel. Now, that's probably not going to bother most people. Realistically, it's probably not going to bother me much, but I do like for long-term use and detailed tasks and the ability to work for a prolonged period of time, I do like having thicker steel through here. So I actually personally, and in my experience, prefer the grind on the Gen 1 a little bit more. I like having that, thicker steel there. And you'll see personally in my design and the way I design, like here on the Chonto, granted very different, but you'll see just for that, particular detail that I'm almost 2/3 of the way through before the grind starts. I like a ton of flat steel, so when you're gripping the knife, you have a nice wide area to bear on, and it's not creating any hot spots. But again, that's just my personal preference and my particular design taste. But it just goes to show that with the Gen 2, tweaks are being made, blade geometry being changed, the ability to refine a design and make it something just a little bit different to hone in on what, in this case, the designer, and being Vic Lin, decides is the most optimum design for his blade. Now with that, let's get into the handles. So as you take a look at both of these, again, they seem to be very similar. Now keep in mind the fact that on the Gen 2, they have introduced some of the 3D machining techniques. There are Gen 2 versions that are completely smooth, like here on the Gen 1. But that's not really the difference I'm here to talk about. What I'm going to talk about is the shape. As you take a look here, and you can see, very similar at an initial glimpse. However, the Gen 2 having a much nicer index when it comes to the rear and the pommel end. You'll see that there is that hidden lanyard, which I believe, if I'm not mistaken, this detail came out for the very first time, I think, with the Aurora Borealis Wolverine. This was the first time that I had seen it, and this is something that's been used now on a bunch of models, and I like that detail quite a bit. It completely wraps the handle, keeps it so that if you're going into stabbing, you have nice comfort all the way around, and the ability to kind of hide that lanyard inside the handle just a bit, which to me is much more advantageous than what you see on the Gen 1. So I do like that quite a bit. But the other thing it does is look at the difference in the flare on that pommel end. The Gen 2 flaring out nicely, which will greatly aid in the ability to index, especially during chopping. That's going to make a big difference in how much you have to re-grip and to keep the handle in your hands while you're swinging hard and doing some of those more aggressive tasks. And a couple last little subtleties. For example, you'll notice that on the Gen 1, a 3-bolt design holding those handle scales onto the tang of the knife, whereas here on the Gen 2, going to more of a 2-bolt design. Again, it's just some subtleties, not a ton of differences, but it's all the little differences that start to make a difference as a whole across the entire design. And the fact that there is no bolt in the middle should aid in a little bit of additional comfort. You're not going to get any hot spots from the little cutouts and drill holes in the scales. Sometimes that can kind of rub on you just a little bit. You can feel it in your fingers. It's kind of up against your palm. And it's not a big deal. A lot of knives have a 3-bolt design. But if you could go to a 2-bolt design and it's equally effective, well, why not? So in this particular case, I would say it works. Now, one final thing to say here about the knife itself, check out that finish. Over the course of time and through, use and through testing and through different designers and experimentation and making hundreds and hundreds, if not at this point, thousands and thousands of knives, they've taken what is otherwise a great working finish and made it an incredible working finish that's just a piece of art at the same time. This finish is ridiculous. Phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. Incredibly well done. Looks amazing. And is functional art all at the same time. It's really cool. And as if that wasn't enough, Work Tuff Gear always stepping it up with the Sheath. I've said it a million times on my primary Outer Limitless channel. The reality is a knife can be great, but if the sheath isn't great, it can make or break your user experience. And so with that, the Sheath has overgone an incredible transformation as well. And so there's no doubt that the Gen 1 Sheath was more than serviceable. Incredible retention. Work Tuff Gear has always done that very well. So great retention, not a lot in the way of rattle. Excellent rivets, nicely done. The ability to use multiple different carry systems. Again, just a good quality kydex, fairly low profile, and especially given the size of the knife. Here you can see it is that fold over taco style, but Work Tuff Gear always improving. And so the Gen 2 has much more in the way of rivets, much more in the way of variability in terms of what you can use for a carry system, and the look is insane. Now, some people don't prefer a pancake. I get that. Little more material, but I like this for myself personally because I greatly enjoy the multiple carry options and the ability to build this more appropriately into a kit. You can see at this point playing with patterns, designs, which lends very well. The entire sheath will drain. So that is functional as much as anything else. And in terms of the fit, just insane. Zero rattle now. Like, is there any on a knife of this size? It's so refined, so dialed in, yet at the same time, the ability to deploy the knife like crazy easy. These sheaths are so good now that the sheaths themselves have transcended to Gen 2. It's not just the knife, it's the entire package. So again, Work Tuff gear paying attention to all of the details, and I would say in many ways, better than everybody else. And so again, I'm not talking about Damascus patterns and fine little details and the knick-knacky little things that you can do with custom knives. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the hard-use serviceable fixed blade that the enthusiast can get in their hands and go and do some serious work for a very fair and affordable price, yet a company that's not going to stop with great being the end result. They're going to go from great to beyond with every single design that they put out, and the ability to have the flexibility, the willingness to go from the Gen 1 to the Gen 2, and in many cases, Gen 3 or above. They don't just stop at what they think is fantastic. They push to go to the next level with attention to detail in every aspect of every blade to the point where you know you're getting damn near perfection. You can't say that about everybody. You can barely say that about anybody, but you could absolutely say that about Work Tuff gear. And so, all right, guys, I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you so much for stopping by on Outer Limitless Blades. Again, I've moved all my knife content from my Outer Limitless channel to here on Outer Limitless Blades. Please like, share, and subscribe. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much to the people at Work Tuff Gear who did provide this for review. And if you like this content, take a look at my other channels. Outer Limitless, my outdoor hiking, camping, backpacking channel. Outer Limitless 2, which is tactical and firearms. Here, Outer Limitless Blades, which is knives, saws, axes, all the sharp and pointy stuff. And Outer Limitless Lights, where I cover all my flashlights, headlamps, interior, exterior lighting, you name it, that's Outer Limitless Lights. So, all right, guys, thanks for stopping by. I hope you like what you saw. I hope you found it a little bit informative. If you like what you saw, please like, share, and subscribe. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Take care now. I'll see you soon.